Kim Kohler from Emerging Creatively Tutorials, and this is part 2 of a free workshop I'm having on creativity and jewelry making. So if by chance you're seeing this video without seeing part 1, I suggest that you go back to part 1 and watch that first. That was a creativity booster, and it was a fun little exercise, so I hope you enjoyed that. That activity will come into play more tomorrow for part 3, but today I'm just going to be teaching you a few jewelry skills so that you are able to make the project for tomorrow. So specifically, we're going to be learning stringing, and I'm going to teach you how to make a clasp. So let's get right into it. Hi there, so this is the first jewelry skills lesson for this workshop. For this lesson, I'm going to teach you basically how to string, and for the purposes of this lesson, I'm actually going to just make a simple strand bracelet just to show you, and mostly because I really just want to make a bracelet with these beads. So I'm going to use it as an example to show you how to string. And then you'll be able to use that for the jewelry lesson for tomorrow. So let me show you what you'll need. So you'll obviously need beads, and when we actually do the project, you'll learn more about beads. The beads I'm using for this, in case you're curious, are check beads. They're round. I'm using rose colored and olive colored, and they're really pretty. And I just have a pattern laid out here. Whoops. Of how I want them to go. And for this particular lesson, you're going to need a clasp, but when we do the actual project, we'll be making our own clasp. So for that, you won't need a clasp. I mean, you will need a clasp, but you're going to be making it. Okay, and then I just wanted to show you beading wire. So I have a couple of different kinds here right now. So this is 49 strand. It's a very soft drape. It's very strong, and there's actually 49 strands in the wire, which you cannot see or count, but it's actually very good, very sturdy. It's great because it doesn't get kinked up. It stays real flexible, and this is kind of a more professional, stronger wire. There are many different wires. This is a 7-strand wire. This is kind of more on the lower end. I'm not sure if this is the lowest or not. There's a big price difference between the two as well, of course, as you would probably expect. So basically, what I usually use, which I don't have any on me, is kind of an in-between 19 strand, and that works pretty well for me in most circumstances. It's durable, it holds up. 7 strand has worked fine for me too. If you're not doing anything, you know, super heavy, and if you're just making it for yourself as well, then you'll be fine with that. But since I started using 49 strands, I definitely prefer it. But like I said, kind of have to choose based on probably your budget, because there is a big price difference. And then you'll need crimp beads. So these are just little beads that look like little silver tubes. And then I have a couple optional things you may want to use. These are crimp bead covers, and they just go over the crimp beads, and then you close them, and they just look like beads. So it kind of covers up the crimp bead. It makes it look a little nicer. And then these are wire guards, which I'll show you how to use, but you don't necessarily have to use these. These protect your wire, so when they're, like, say, against the clasp, it doesn't wear down the wire and then eventually cause it to break. It just kind of protects the wire. But again, that's optional. The covers are optional, but you do need the crimp beads. The tools you'll need are wire cutters, and then a crimp tool. And if you've seen other videos of mine, I've mentioned you can actually just use a chain nose plier And if that's what you have, that's fine. If you're going to do a lot of stringing, though, you might as well just get a crimp tool because it is so much easier. If you are using the wire guards, then you're going to need a couple jump rings. I'm just using 4mm. So to get started, we're going to cut some of this wire, and I'm just going to loosely measure around my wrists and then leave a few extra inches on each side, so I have plenty of room to work with. And I've often said this, but it's always better to cut a little more than you need than not enough, because if you do not cut enough, then you ruin that piece of wire altogether. You've wasted it because you're going to have to take the bracelet apart and start over again with a new piece of wire. So if you just start out with a little bit too much, you know, more than you think is necessary, you're actually saving yourself in the end. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to show you using wire guards how to string, and I'll kind of show you and tell you how to do it without too. So if you are using wire guards, they just sort of look like horseshoes, and then they have two tubes on the ends, and then the curved part on the top is kind of open, so the wire is exposed on that part. So to get started, you would just slide through one side and then back down through the other side, and then you just pull it up tight, and so it will stay up tight once we put the crimp bead on. So for now it might not. Now if you are not going to use a wire guard, I will show you momentarily how you need to set this up. So once you have the wire guard on, you need a crimp bead. So you will slide a crimp bead on, to the wire, and then you're going to slide it over. There's this shorter end too. You're going to slide it over both wires. If I can get this lined up. And then pull it up tight. And then you're going to make sure this wire guard is pulled up tight as well. And now I'm going to my crimp tool. So to crimp the crimp bead, you'll see there are two notches in a crimp tool. There's one that's closer to the handle that's a little bit larger. And then there's one that's closer to the tip that's a little bit smaller. So you'll first put it in the larger notch, and then you'll put it into the smaller notch. So when you put it into the larger notch, which I'm going to do, you just kind of line it up in the middle there, and you just squeeze the crimp tool closed, and that actually closes the crimp bead, and it puts a little notch in the middle of the crimp bead. So now you're going to put it into the smaller notch of the tool, and you want to line it up, because what you're going to do is where that notch is, there's, you know, it's sort of like a bend in the middle here. You're going to actually bend the crimp bead in half. So when you line it up in the smaller one, just make sure you line it up so when you close it, it closes it in half. And that's all there is really to a crimp bead. Okay, so now if you want to kind of cover this crimp bead up a little bit, because you know it's like folded metal, and if you want it to kind of have a more bead-like look, you have these crimp bead covers, and they kind of look like C's or maybe a little clam, but when you pinch them closed, it just looks like a silver bead. So I just take my crimp tool and place my crimp bead cover in with the opening facing out, and then just slide it so it's over top of the crimp bead. So I'm just, you know, putting it right over top, and then just close the cover over it. And so now it should just look like a regular silver bead. So for me, I like to actually use 2 crimp beads on each side of my projects, my jewelry projects, and some people might find that overkill, so you don't have to do that. I do suggest that if you have heavy beads or something like that, something you want to really be protective of, to use 2 crimp bead covers, but probably normal everyday bracelets like this one you don't. I do it because it's kind of the way I was taught, and I don't know, I just always have done it this way, so that's kind of just how I do it. So what I do is slide on a small bead, and this bead is too small, so I'm just going to use one of my beads that I'm using for my bracelet and slide it on. The hole was too small, it wouldn't go over both ends of the wire. So I'm just going to use this bead, which is a bead for my bracelet. Usually I like to use a small one to start, but this will be fine. And then I slide on another crimp bead, and I do exactly what I just did again. So you slide the crimp bead over both wires and kind of pull it kind of snug, and then I'm going to close it with my crimp bead tool. So first the larger notch and then the smaller notch. And then I am going to put a cover over it. Oops. Okay, so that is basically how I do it, and then I just will bead the rest of my beads on, and I like to kind of go through with both wires another bead or so, and then we'll trim off the excess wire at the end. So that is beading. And so if you're not using a wire guardian, I'm going to show you now how I would do that. Okay, so this is an alternative if you do not want to use wire guardians, or you don't have them, or wire guards actually, how to set this up. So I have cut a new piece of wire, and I am stringing a crimp bead onto it, and then I'm just taking half of my clasp and sliding that on next, folding the wire around, and then I pull it right back through the crimp bead. And then you want to pull it up close, but you don't want it to be super tight because you want there to be able to be some room for the clasp to move around. And then you just close the crimp bead like I showed you before, the larger notch and then the smaller notch. And there you have it. And then if you want to do 2 crimp beads, you do it the same way as before. So here's my crimp bead cover first. And then I just add a bead and then another crimp bead. And then I would do exactly what I just showed you, and I'd continue beading the rest of my bracelets. And I should mention, you would do exactly the same thing on the other end as well. Okay, so now that we have this end done, we're just going to bead all of our beads on, and since we're making a bracelet and we get close to the end, I'll measure around my wrist to make sure that it's the right size before I finish it. So I'm going to go ahead and bead all the beads, and I'll be back. Okay, so I have my bracelet beaded, and I've checked to make sure it goes around my wrist, and it does. And I should say I have a very snug fit at this point, but I'm going to be adding one more bead in the clasp, so I like my bracelet's a little loose, so that will account for that. So on this end, and again, if you are not using a bead guardian, if you're not using a wire guardian, excuse me, then you would do what we did on the other side that I showed you a second ago. You would do a crimp bead, a bead, a crimp bead, and then the other end of the clasp, and then pull it back down through. For this end, I'm using my wire guard, so I'm going to show you how we set that up. So we do a crimp bead, and then another bead, and again, that's not necessarily necessary, but I like to do it, so it's up to you to do a second crimp bead. So, and then another crimp bead, and now I am just going to thread on a wire guard. So again, we just go up through one of the tubes, and then back around, and back through the other end. And now we're going to pull this wire, and we're going to pull it through the crimp bead, sorry, okay, here we go, the crimp bead, the bead, the other crimp bead, and then another bead or two. And then we're just gonna you just kind of have to pull everything tight. So I'm just making sure the rest of my bracelet, everything is, you know, doesn't have to be super tight because you want to have some flexibility, but somewhat tight. And then maybe pull it a little bit. I like to have it, you know, not super tight, just a little bit loose. And then we're just going to go ahead and close the crimp beads on this side. So just like before, the big notch and then the small notch. And then I'm going to put covers, crimp bead covers over both of these crimp beads. This one got a little bit funky, so I'm just trying to fix it. I closed it crooked, or maybe it was just crooked to begin with. Okay, and now we're just going to trim off the excess wire very close to that last bead, and make sure you only cut the extra wire, not the wire that's beaded on. And actually, before I do this, I usually pull everything just to make sure I have everything closed properly. And so now we just have to put on our clasp. So if you are not using wire guardians, you're done because you put your clasp on the wire directly. But for those of us using wire guards, we're going to go ahead and open up 2 jump rings and attach the clasp to the end. I'm going to show you how to open up a jump ring. I have a pair of chain nose pliers and a pair of bent nose pliers, but you can use any pliers that are flat on the inside. And I'm going to hold the jump ring. You'll find a little slit where it's open. So on either side of the slit, you put 1 pair of pliers. And when you open a jump ring, you don't want to pull out. You don't want to go, you want to kind of pull sideways. So the circle will still stay intact, but it will be open. So pull one end towards you and one end away from you. And then you just are going to put that in the loop you made with the wire guardian. And then you put the other end, oops, you put the one end of the clasp in. And then you just close the jump ring the same way you opened it, but I like to go back and forth past the point of closure a few times. And then you have the clasp attached. And then you just do the same thing for the other side. So that is how you string. So we'll be right back in a second with how to make your own custom clasp. So what you will need to make this clasp is wire, and this is 18 gauge wire, so it's a little bit stiffer. You'll need wire cutters. You'll need round nose pliers, a ruler, and then something cylindrical. I like to use the end of a paintbrush because it's about the right size, or you could use maybe a pen or something else. So first, we're going to cut a piece of the wire to about 3 inches long, and of course you can make your clasp bigger or smaller. That's the great thing about making your own jewelry. And then I like to just make sure each side is cut with a flush cut, so with the back of the wire cutters. And then we're just going to make a small loop. And on one end. And then I'm going to get my paintbrush, and I'm just going to start to work this wire a little bit. So I'm going to go around, and a lot of this is just by sight. So, you know, it's about that far. Actually, it's almost like making earring wires if you have done that before. This is kind of how you would start an earring wire. But I like to kind of push this in close, and then we make another loop, another bend, I guess, back out. Okay. So this is what we have so far. I actually like this to be a little bit smaller than that. So I'm just going to kind of use my round nose pliers to kind of bend and shape this the way I want. Alright. And then on this end, I'm just going to come in and make a loop on this side. Alright, so then you can just kind of adjust this how you want it. And no two of these are going to turn out the same. This is my first one. Alright. So now we're going to hammer this. Alright, so hammering just makes this all stay in place and makes the wire harder. So I'm using a chasing hammer, and this is a metal block. You could do this on an anvil, and I've heard people using wooden blocks too, but I don't know that that would work as well. So you just hammer it. Hammer with your finger. And it also flattens this out a little too. I had this just a little bit wonky, so. Alright. So we've hammered it. So now basically to use this, you would either want to just use a jump ring, which I have here, and then you just kind of attach this with a jump ring or wire wrapping on the other side. Or actually what would be kind of cool, actually this will work, if you have like a wire wrapped bead link, you could use that, one end of that, as the end of the clasp too. So that is how you make a clasp.